go. And of course, I'm starting a whole new thing, right? A whole new asset, if you will. That's actually one of the cool things they added to Blender 3.0 is an asset manager. I'll probably dabble with it and show it to you guys on our second project, our spaceship, right? It's not necessary to use, but it can be kind of cool, particularly if you want to kind of make pieces that you want to reuse again and again to add like little rivets or piston parts or like little thruster engines on the outside of surface ships can kind of be cool. Often they kind of call it like greebling, right, where you have a bunch of, or kit bashing. But we'll wait until our more advanced project, Spaceship, to really kind of start to show you how to set up and use some of the asset browser for Blender 3, right? But in this case, I want to just, like I said, I want to show you guys curves and how to use the screw modifier to create a column, right? And then our next set of videos will be making the room, and I'll kind of show you how to create a room shape, do some booleans, right, kind of stuff like that. We'll talk a little bit more about why we can use some n-gons on these kinds of meshes, whereas certain other meshes you really want to stay with quads. Quads are always something good to stay with a lot of the time, but sometimes you can get away with n-gons, particularly on flat, non-animated surfaces that can't really get in any trouble, right? And we've seen that a little bit on our furniture, and we'll definitely see that in a room. So we'll kind of have a bit more of a deeper discussion on that. All right. But in this case, I want to start a whole new scene, so I'm just going to go right when this splash screen pops up, right, new file, general. And that creates our cube there. Now in this case, I'm going to go to modeling workspace, because that kind of minimizes some aspects and kind of, you know, it's just a more focused modeling workspace. Now, in this case, remember, we always like to kind of turn our camera and our light off, right? So I always go to my outliner and just turn the eyeballs off for those. You don't have to, but it just declutters the visual stuff in the scene here. All right. Now, in this case, I don't really need or want this cube, right? We're doing something different with this. So if I just hit 3 for face mode, right, I can go to delete faces, right? And that gets rid of that object, right? You could technically do an object mode as well, right? So remember, if I undo, and I go to 4, right? Today's mini quiz, 4 for object select, right? I could always just delete the object itself, right? So 4 to make sure we're back out in object mode. I can hit delete. And then you'll see the actual cube primitive's gone, right? You kind of noticed beforehand that if I deleted the faces, the cube object was actually kind of still there, even though it was empty, right? It's one of the things we've kind of talked about before, where objects are kind of more of a nebulous concept than you think they are, right? It's really just kind of an invisible box that polygons, a bunch of polygons can be in that don't even touch. Or in that case, when I deleted all the polygons, the cube object was still there. You can even have an object that's empty of polygons, right? So in this case, I went to object mode 4, right? It's our quiz for today. And I simply just went to delete and deleted the object, right? Hit delete and deletes the object. And that puts us in that kind of nice place where there's no object in there except the camera and light. Now, at this point, it's probably going to be better to go to like a side view, right? So far, we've been primarily modeling in perspective, but there are orthographic views. Orthographic means without perspective, right? So you can actually go to top, front, side. One of the easier ways is this kind of little view compass up right here. You guys have noticed kind of that right up here, kind of in the top right corner, right next to outliner, is this little, it really looks like your axes, right? There's X, Y, Z color-coded, and then there's kind of some positive, negative versions of it. You can actually click on those to set you kind of to a uniform, kind of flat side shape, right? If you want to get back to perspective, just Alt-left click to rotate. But believe it or not, F1, F2, F3 actually do your orthographics, right? F1, front orthographic. F2, right orthographic. You can kind of see it up here, particularly if you have, actually in this case you don't even have to have statistics on for it, but F3 for top. F4 goes back to camera perspective. But like I said, just Alt-left click for camera rotate will actually always take you back to perspective. So in that case, if you want to go back to perspective, just rotate your camera, right? It'll automatically do it. But you do have the buttons here as well, right? See how Y will do one version of it, and then you can kind of do the other, right? So front, back, left, right. So you kind of have these guys right here that can do top, bottom, and all that stuff. So this, of course, can get you there as well. But also you have quick keys, F1, F2, F3. And we want something like a front one, right? Or a side one, right? Front or like left, right. So not the Z-axis, but definitely either Y or X. And it sets it kind of flat here, right? Remember, Alt-left click will set perspective back on. And then you can either just click the X or the Y-axis. Doesn't really matter which one for what we're going to do here. Let's use right. But there are quick keys, F1, F2, F3. But you don't actually have to do those. There's some pretty good buttons for them right there. And that kind of gives us a side view, right? The right view. So it's actually flat without perspective. It makes it easier to create and draw the curve. So what I can do is I can go to Add, Curve. Now, there are a couple different curve types. I want to keep it as simple as possible for you. Also, usually you don't really need to have a Bezier curve. I prefer to keep it simpler without the handles for the Bezier curve. So Add Curve, Nurbs curve, right? Nurbs curve. So there is actually a curve primitive. We'll just create it. And you see how it actually drops in your flat, kind of from your top view, right? What you can do then, though, is hit 1, right? 1 for vertex select. And you'll notice that you can actually go in here with your box select and start to move vertices up, right? So in this case, you see how it's kind of flat, though. So this is actually one of those things where if you wanted to, we can actually go even back before we create the curve. So I just undid, right? Control-Z until it was gone. And I can go to Add Curve, Nurbs Curve. And you'll notice the bottom left corner, right? When you first add it and you don't do anything else to it, you'll see the bottom left corner, which we know from our bevel, our extrude, our inset tools. That bottom left corner will have that little menu, that kind of like that little bar that's above the bottom, kind of very bottom of Blender. That's Add Nurbs Curve. I can click on that, and you'll notice that I can actually align to different views. But I can also actually rotate at the object level this stuff, right? So that's kind of one of those things you can do. You can actually rotate it here. Now, I would actually probably just go to vertex mode. 1 for vertex for all of them selected. Hit E for rotate. And then we can always start to rotate it on the green axis. And you see as I start to rotate it, you'll notice that rotate becomes available at the bottom left corner, right? So I can click on that, and you see how I can actually give it an angle. Let's say 90 degrees. The reason I like to do it this way is so that my object is still set to 0, 0, 0, right? That'll make everything work more correctly. So even though you can actually, when you first create a curve, kind of rotate it right from there, believe it or not, your move, rotate, scale tools, once you start to use them, you move it, rotate, or scale it, options become available down here that you can open up to give you more precise controls over saying, hey, I want it to be exactly 90 degrees. It's better to rotate the vertices, in my opinion, though, because it keeps the rotations for the object all zeroed out, right? And that's generally better for working with your modifiers, generally. So in this case, I just want to make sure to give you guys kind of a deeper look at that, but just to kind of show this off one more time, I'll delete the curve, right? Add, curve, Nurbs curve. There we go. 1 for vertex to go to vertices selection mode. All of the vertices are selected, so I hit E for rotate. And then I can just rotate on the yellow axis up here a bit. And you see once I start to rotate on that green, right, axis, the Y, you'll see that you have rotate down here available. I can click on that, and I could specifically type in the 90 degrees that I want instead of 67, which is what I did eyeballing it. Now if I go to, say, like the X, you'll notice this is actually flat, right? And now what I can do is I can hit W for move. It's right here, though. And 1 for vertex. And I can just go in here and I can select vertices just by left-click dragging a box, right? Remember, default select tool is box select. And our move tool right now is set to select box. Remember, you can kind of adjust it, right? If it's set to tweak, it might behave a little weird, so maybe turn it to select box. Or active tool, that kind of works well for both. And I could actually just start to select the vertex. And remember, you can move along these handles, but middle mouse button will do view move. And so I can actually kind of move these off center a little bit. And simply to extend this, I extrude. The extrude tool, right? Control E. So if I hit Control E for extrude, you see it's right here. I can grab that handle, or I can grab the white, or just middle mouse button, and you see how I could extrude more, and I can keep extruding this curve. So once you grab a point on the ends, you can actually use the extrude tool to extend that curve more, right? So the extrude tool's right there, but it is still Control E. You see how there's more curve there now? Now if I wanted to add more points in here, I could select 2 or even 3. And we know that there's a right-click tool, right? So this is all new. We'll do a bunch of review lecture on it this week, as well as some old review lecture. But if I right-click, right, we know right-click brings up our context menus. In this case, instead of being object like we did for our shade smooth, right-click, oops, that was me banging my table, brings up the curve context menu. And at the very top is Subdivide. There's some other really cool ones like tilt and radius that we'll see later on, right? But not on this. But the very top is Subdivide. And what that does is it actually adds more points in between, so that I can easily move these in to create more complicated shapes. So we can, of course, extrude. There we go. You can technically draw a freehand spline, but that's kind of a little bit imprecise, right? But we can kind of do some neat extrusion stuff here just by selecting the ends and Control E for extrude. But there is a specific extrude curve tool, but it is using the same quick key as before. And then we can just select these curves and we can kind of move them around a little bit, right, to get more of the shape we want, or these vertices, I should say. And then if there's areas I want to do more to, I can select at least 2, but you can do more. Right-click Subdivide, and that gives us more here that I can move with. And remember, I'm using middle mouse button with the move tool, because that's view move, right? But remember, that's that white circle in the center is view move, basically. I can just keep selecting at least 2, right-click Subdivide, and that gives me more. And you see how as I have more points, I can get more detail, kind of sharper creases. Right? If we move this down or up, it kind of changes the flow and shape as well. And so we can keep coming in here and adjusting this shape. So the end vertices, you can extrude. Control E. In between the rest of them, if you select at least 2 vertices, but you can also do 3 or 4, if you right-click and Subdivide, that will actually add vertices in between those. And then the rest of it's just moving those vertices. And that's still 1 for vertex mode, right? So you see how a lot of what you already know, like vertex selection, move, still, all that stuff still works on this curve. Even extrude does, right? You just have to do it on the end vertices, right? The vertices that are at the bottom of the end of it. So now I can hit 4 to go back to object mode, and you can see there's our curve. And you see how it's just nicer to kind of draw this from a flat shape. So I kind of went to one of my side views here. Alt left click to rotate to kind of actually give us, you know, the perspective view for it. But you also notice how I kind of drew only half the shape. That's because we don't need the whole thing, right? Remember, the screw modifier basically is going to kind of extrude this out in a circle to create a cylindrical shape. So now we go to blue wrench. And the hard part was actually the curve creation. But once you actually see how to do that, it's actually pretty nice, pretty easy to work with. We already know a lot of the tools, and they work in a similar fashion. So blue wrench, add modifier. And you'll notice that there is a modifier in here called screw. Screw. And I'll apply it. And by default, it's set to the Z-axis to go up, so we're good. But you see how it could be on the Y or the X. But the default Z is what we want. So we kind of drew it on the side here. And you see how it made a nice column for us? Now you'll notice that there are some controls here in the screw modifier. Angle will allow you to make more or less of a screw, right? So you can kind of see what it's actually doing if you go 0 to 360. Because what's 0 to 360? A circle, right? 0 to 180, half a circle. But you also notice that this is great at doing these kinds of shapes, but if you actually do a couple of iterations and you actually adjust the screw part of it, right, the screw section here, and you adjust more iterations, or less, right, you actually notice that you can actually kind of create a screw shape. And of course, you see how you can keep adjusting the angle to make that work as well. So you notice because this is a modifier, I can go and adjust all these properties and it keeps changing. Now, do we need to do that part of the screw modifier? No. I just want to make sure that you guys have in some video form that if you ever wanted to make springs, make a much simpler shape than this, and you can make springs, right? You can actually, if you wanted to, add a curved circle, right? And that'll make you a really great spring. Now, of course, I don't want screws, so I'm going to turn that to 0. I don't want iterations, so we'll turn that back to 1. And I'll set this back to 360. So honestly, the defaults should work great for us for this. But I just want to make sure you know that the defaults actually are a great way to kind of make complicated cylindrical structures based on a curve. But that this is actually more versatile than that. It can actually be used to make screw or spring shapes, right? And that's where making your angle bigger than 360, adjusting the screw number so it's not 0, and giving it some iterations can give you some control to make a neat screw shape. But we don't, that's kind of overkill for what we need. It's just neat to know that you have this that does both this and kind of a version of it that's more of a screw or helix or spring shape. Now, this is still a curve primitive, so if I hit 1 for vertices, you'll notice that it goes to the curve mode. I could select all the vertices, and I could move this out to adjust the width of this column or the thickness. If I want, I could select a single vertex and move it in or out to adjust the shape, right? So you can easily go back in here, since it's a modifier, and add a little bit more, right? Right-click the subdivide, maybe grab this vertex, move it just along the y-axis. And you can actually adjust that curve some more. So that's kind of neat, right? It's kind of neat. Of course, we have the ability to apply this modifier. Now you'll notice it says transform curve to mesh in order to apply constructive modifiers. So usually you can just apply a modifier or apply all if you've got the modifier add-on turned on. But usually with curve-based stuff, you have to right-click again, right? Remember, right-click brings up your context menu, right? We started addressing that, talking about it when we were doing shade smooth, right? And we're going to see it more and more as we go along. In this case, it's object mode, and that's where that shade smooths at, but you'll see there's a convert to area, and we can convert this to mesh. And you notice the modifier goes away, and we've got our object density. Now, if I undo and I go back here, we can actually adjust the amount, right? If I don't want as many edge loops around this direction, I could turn steps and viewport down, right? If I don't want as many in kind of, that actually kind of usually does that for us, right? So basically your steps and viewport controls are kind of right there. And that just kind of makes it do a little bit of simpler form for us in here. And then if I right-click, convert to mesh, see how it's kind of a bit simpler, right? It's a bit simpler. If you needed to maybe adjust the other direction, I'm trying to remember, I think we go to curve mode. I remember, or just select the curve. I don't remember how to do that. There's a way to do that. I'm just blanking on it right now. Actually, you know what? It's going to be curved. There we go. Just blanked on it for a moment, right? So remember, there is, since this is a curve and a curve modifier, if you go to the actual green curve down here, right, you'll see there's resolution preview. And what we could do is we could start to control this, and you see how it kind of controls the resolution this way. So the screw modifier itself only controls the edge loops around this direction. You would have to actually go to the curve properties here, the green curve, and turn down the resolution preview to get this simpler. Just took me a minute to remember. Convert to mesh. There we go. You see how it's a simpler mesh to work from? So this is kind of some good controls there. I blanked for a minute. I was like, oh yeah, curve, duh. Right? And that gives you control over your resolution, how many polygons you want this direction and this direction. All right. So I think that's a great place to stop there.